Now that we can do knit and purl stitches, it's time to look at increasing. So increasing in knitting is where you deliberately add additional stitches to your work as you go. This is used in many different patterns for many different reasons. One is for shaping, so for doing different sizes. The other is for decorative purposes. There's lots of reasons why you would use it. So in this video, we're going to look at two different methods. And in the booklet that goes with this class, we talk a little bit more in depth about increasing, how increasing leans, etc. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knit my first 2 stitches before I begin, because I like to do my increasing in a little bit from the edge. We talk a lot more about that in finishing school. I knit my first 2 stitches, and then I'm going to do an increase stitch. The increase stitch that we're going to do first is called a knit front and back, and this makes 1 stitch from 2 stitches. So into my next stitch I insert my needle as if I'm going to knit my stitch. I then take my yarn around my needle, again as if I were knitting a normal stitch. I then bring my needle back out, and this is where it changes. Instead of slipping the stitch off my left needle, I take my right needle over the top of my left needle and then insert my needle into the back of the stitch that's still on the needle, give it a little wiggle as it can be tight, and then knit that stitch as normal and bring that off. I have now changed 1 stitch into 2 stitches. And we'll see that again. So into my next stitch, I insert my needle to knit. I take my yarn around as if I were knitting a regular stitch, bring back my needle catching the yarn. I then pull a little bit of extra yarn through as it can be quite tight. I then take my needle over and into the back of the same stitch. Little wiggle for tightness, bring the yarn around, bring it out, and then pull the stitch off the left needle, and I have created 2 stitches on my right needle from the 1 stitch. It is really important to notice that this is 2 stitches made from 1 stitch, because there are 2 different types of increase. This type and the other where you don't use another stitch to make your stitch, and we're going to see that now. So that was my knit front and back. The next increase we're going to look at is called a yarn over. I'm just going to knit 1 stitch to move on a little. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a yarn over. A yarn over is a little bit of a funny name. So if you're in a knit position with your yarn, the first thing you do when we're doing a yarn over is you bring the yarn to the front of your work. Once your yarn has been brought through the needles to the front of the work, you might be inclined to purl your next stitch, but what we're actually going to do is we're going to knit it. So we insert the needle to knit, and then we bring the yarn over the top of the needle and around the needle, and then we knit the next stitch. And this is how a yarn over gets its name. You bring the yarn over your needle, and that creates a stitch between 2 stitches. So you didn't use a stitch to create it, you created it using the yarn that you were knitting with, as opposed to the stitches on either side. So let's see that again. I bring my yarn between my needles, I then knit the next stitch while bringing the yarn over the top of my needle. And that is another increase stitch. You will often see that used as a decorative stitch as well as an increase stitch. It is balanced out by a decrease stitch, but we'll talk more about decorative yarn overs later on. Right now, you now know that you have 2 types of increase: the knit front and back, which is made from 1 other stitch, and a yarn over, which is made between 2 stitches. And they are 2 of the most commonly used increase stitches that you will find in knitting. There are many more increase stitches in finishing school, and we can talk about those as well as we go on. You may be wondering what to do with those stitches when you come to them on the other side of your work. So I'm now going to purl back across the next row, and I'll show you what to do as you come to those stitches that you have just made. The first stitch we're going to come to is going to be one of our yarn overs. which you can see is my second neck stitch. I knit the stitch beside it. I then knit the stitch as if it was a normal stitch. So I have a little bit more space to go into, but I go into that stitch as if it was a normal stitch already sitting on my needle, and I purl that stitch. Then I will do the same with my next stitch. I would go into it in the same way as I go into any stitch to purl. If I was doing a knit row, I would put my needle into the stitch as if I were going to knit it, as if it was the same as any other stitch. The next thing I come to is my 2 stitches that I made from one stitch, and I purl these as normal as well. The one thing to watch about these stitches is that they may be a little bit tight because you'll have created them from one stitch, and then just give yourself a small bit of extra yarn as you do the purl stitch to make sure that they sit and are exactly the same size as the stitches around them. So now you can see our increase stitches. So you can see our yarn overs sit between 2 stitches, and our knit front and back emerge from one stitch. Another small point to note is that with my knit front and back, they lean ever so slightly to the right. And that is a feature of many increase and decreasing stitches, except the yarn over, which does not have a lean in either direction. There'll be more details about the leans in the booklet for this class.